really interesting panel where we're going to talk about a lot of security stuff at both the national security level and also at the corporate security level. Moderating the panel will be Kirsten Rulf, who is from the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. And we also have the CTO from RSA, which is the leading corporate security company in the entire world. And we also have Megan Stifel from the Atlantic Council, who comes to us by way of the White House. So please welcome the panel to the stage.
Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this expert session. My name is Kirsten Rulf. As Stephen already said, in my professional life, I'm with the Berkman Klein Center. I'm a research fellow there at Harvard Law School on artificial intelligence, its ethics and governance, mainly focusing on algorithmic bias and on compliance issues. I also realized that the three of us and one other person is what stands between you and hopefully an excellent lunch. But I promise you that the two people left and right from me are outstanding experts on the question that's sort of the overarching question of this day, namely, what is a new trust model balancing security and privacy in an ever-evolving world? So let me introduce you, the two people next to me. On my left is Megan Stifel. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Statecraft Center, and she is the cybersecurity policy director at the DC-based civil society organization Public Knowledge. Megan previously worked at the White House National Security Council staff as a director for international cyber policy and a counsel in the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. So she's an attorney too. Welcome, Megan. And to my right is Zulfikar Ramzan. He is currently the Chief Technology Officer of RSA, and prior to that, he was the CTO of Elastica, which was acquired by Blue Coat Symantec, and the Chief Scientist at SourceFire, which was acquired by Cisco. And he's actually Dr. Ramzan. He holds a PhD from what we in Cambridge call the VOTEC down the river, which is MIT. It's a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science with a lot of work on cryptography, as far as I understand. And Zulfikar, let me stay with you for just a minute and throw at you an anecdote from my professional life. I currently teach a class at Harvard Law School on compliance and computation, and it's supposed to teach future lawyers the reason why we need a compliance program for AI-driven companies, banks and big tech companies, and basically almost any company these days. And the biggest challenge, however, was to explain those students that see themselves as future C-level executives and future general counsels why this is actually a question, or why security is actually, and trust models are actually questions that matter to them at the C-level. A sort of basic sentiment was like, oh, there's a guy in technology that will take care of it. He will sort of clean up after the kid from the basement. And to me, it actually is something that's doesn't really matter at my C-level job. You could say those are just pompous Harvard kids, and that's true to a certain extent. But I also realized that a few weeks into the semester, we had the Equifax breach, and there were very similar sentiments voiced by their former CEO that also kind of had the attitude of, oh, someone in the sort of IT department should have caught this, someone was responsible, and it didn't seem like security was a lot on his mind in his day job. I understand you work a lot with C-level executives. If you could explain to us a little bit what level security has on a C-level position.
Yeah, that's a great question. So by the way, I'm super happy that you're introducing these topics, at the graduate level at Harvard and the law school. And interestingly enough, at the business school, we're seeing a similar sentiment. So I've actually been down to HBS a couple of times to meet with some of their executive leadership classes to talk about cybersecurity issues. And what's intriguing is that I've noticed that for the first time in a long time, organizations aren't thinking about security as a pure technology problem. They're starting to come around to the fact that security is a fundamental business issue for them. And I think that's been driven by a couple of interesting trends. The first trend is that we're seeing a world in which small failures are leading to mega failures. So the world we live in, as we noticed this morning, is increasingly interconnected, right? Our supply chains are interlinked. Our reliance on third parties has never been greater. No organization exists as an atomic instance unto itself. Typically, it exists as part of something much bigger. And when you have these complex interconnected systems, a small failure in one part of the system can create a massive ripple effect with catastrophic failures elsewhere. So consider some of the biggest data breaches in history. One of the biggest data breaches in history occurred because attackers found a single credential to a third-party HVAC system. Consider the fact that the cyber attack on the Democratic National Committee caused people to ultimately question the foundations of democracy. Consider the fact that the makers of Wi-Fi baby cams became unwitting accessories to the world's largest distributed denial of service attack when those baby cams became co-opted into the Mirai botnet. And so you have these small failures leading to mega failures, and those mega failures are now turning into mega scrutiny for organizations. So we realize that security is not just a concern for a small minority in the IT department. We are seeing CEOs get fired. We're seeing chairpersons of the board get fired or changed, and we're seeing certainly CIOs and CISOs lose their jobs. And so for the first time, the CISO is forced to interface with the CEO and board in a way that's unprecedented, at least at a large scale. And as a result, we're noticing a lot of our organizations taking on a much more business-driven view of security. They're thinking about how do we articulate security concepts in business terms so we can speak to the board and the CEO in business language, as opposed to talking about SQL injection and cross-site scripting and stuff like that, which is quite frankly, if I went to a board meeting and talked about those concepts, the meeting would end in about 30 seconds. I've got to figure out how to talk about these concepts in ways that make sense for that broader audience. So I think that is a prominent trend happening right now. And we'll need both sides to meet in the middle here. I think the technologists are trying to find better ways to talk to the business folks. The business folks are curious to understand how things work at a technical level. The CEOs and boards are incredibly sharp, incredibly smart. They're curious, but they maybe lack the underlying knowledge. And so I think the fact that we have forums like this to be able to discuss these issues helps a long way.
Would it be fair to summarize the current attitude as there is a willingness to spend on prevention rather than just detection?
Yeah, I think there's been an overemphasis on prevention versus detection and response. And something we were talking about on the prep call about the NIST CSF, and I'll let you elaborate on that later. To me, it's an area where the reality is when threats get more and more sophisticated, and in fact, I sort of joke, we talk about advanced threats 5 years ago. To me, that term is almost a misnomer. What I think of as an advanced threat now is pretty much what everyone does. So it's not so much advanced, it's pretty much the modern threat. And these types of threats are very quickly going to get in the front doors. But it's important to keep in mind that the attacker's goal is not just to get in the front door. Just like if I were trying to rob a bank or if someone's trying to rob a bank, the goal of the bank robber is not to get in the front door of the bank. The goal of the bank robber is to get the money in the vault. So you can build a really strong front door, and if the bank robber gets in because you have to open for business, your goal should be to prevent them from getting to their ultimate objective. So actually, it's funny. How many people here watch a TV show called Mr. Robot? I imagine this is a good crowd for it. So actually, I love the show from a technical perspective. The threats are very accurately depicted. There's great proof of concept code. The technical parts are phenomenal. But the one thing that bugs me about that show is it seems like in like one episode, these guys were like breaking into every major organization, getting in, getting the key data assets out, and the episode's done before the hour's over. And in real life, it doesn't work that way. In real life, when people compromise environments, it may take months to find the most critical assets. And so we have a remarkable opportunity to stop the breach from occurring. We may not be able to stop every intrusion, but I do believe we can stop every or at least most breaches.
Right, Megan, let me bring you into the conversation here. I think what we've heard from Zulfikar is basically an evolution on the business side of the sort of corporate norms behavior. You have worked more on the regulatory side. Traditionally, Washington has also been after the fact, but on the prep call, we talked about a new data breach legislation that you see coming maybe in the first quarter of 2018. If you could talk a little bit about that, and if this is also a watershed moment, given what happened in the past year and beyond, and before that, for regulatory frameworks.
Sure. First, let me just quickly say thank you to Intertrust and Klein for including me in the conversation. I'm really delighted to be here, and I commend you on convening this opportunity for us to bring a variety of stakeholders together to talk about these issues. So yes, I think particularly in the wake of the Equifax breach, but also I think in the wake of, we're sort of looking at the maturity landscape of our ability to manage this new digital economy. We're, I think, seeing more and more signs coming from the White House and the Hill, which are the two parts of the equation that we need to get together to have an equal sign that means legislation in the US. We're seeing statements both from the cybersecurity coordinator at the White House, whose name is Rob Joyce, as well as key staff and key members of relevant committees on the Hill talk about the likelihood of data breach legislation. And the question will become kind of what's in it. Will it just require, so in the United States we have obviously we have a sectoral approach to privacy, which means that health information is governed by one law, financial services information is governed by another law, obviously payment card information has its own set of regulations, and then we have 48 states and a few territories that each also have regulations on the protection of sensitive information, which means that there are some states that don't. And the requirements on notifying victims when their information has been compromised varies by state. So in the case of Equifax, that's a Georgia-based company. Georgia does have a data breach requirement. But the challenge, some believe, is that complying with these 48 regulations as sort of state regulations and territorial regulations is a bit of, pardon my French, a crapshoot. Maybe I just won't deploy an adequate security system and an adequate management process, basically a cybersecurity policy, and run the risk that maybe I'll get caught and maybe I won't. So likely the legislation will require some kind of national standard for probably, as someone mentioned earlier, 10,000 users and up. What we wonder is whether it will also, there are some bills that will require the development of a cybersecurity policy within corporations, and similar to, not identical, similar to some of the requirements in GDPR that entities be able to establish and produce proof that they have this framework in mind. I think from consumers, for a consumer, they think that this is useful. While they may not understand it, it may have greater benefit to consumers than simply being notified. Because right now, notification is an after-the-fact matter, right? What we want to see is prevention, and we want to see entities both securing their networks, but also developing secure devices. So I'll leave it at that for right now, and maybe we can jump off.
Federal legislation is something that the Obama administration hasn't achieved, even though it was very alert on technical issues. How do you see the chances for it actually coming through, and what's sort of the time frame for that? And I'm asking with the background of GDPR taking effect in May, and we'll get to that later.
Yes. Well, so there was the Cybersecurity Act of 2015. Actually, the Obama administration did manage to bring across the finish line, which allows companies to share what are called cyber threat indicators and defensive measures, essentially non-content data, unless the content relates directly to the ability for the recipient to understand the indicator. So this is essentially a privacy-enhancing feature, we think. That passed in the very waning days of 2015 and has been under implementation since then. But as I mentioned earlier, this idea that we're in a maturity approach, and in the beginning of the Obama administration, they put forward to the Hill a suite of cybersecurity proposals, basically two survived, one of which was this data breach probability requirement. And for a variety of reasons that we can understand, some of which were logical, some of which were illogical, meaning we weren't able to get the two parties of the equation to put a plus sign there to get legislation. I think at this point, because the sense for consumers, and I think lawmakers, is that there's not enough being done to try and prevent breaches. While we are seeing some progress, I think, in corporations, I think we're still not. I don't know. What percentage would you put on corporations that you're dealing with taking this seriously? Maybe not. I don't mean to say taking it seriously, but really taking on the challenge. So I would put to your question, Kirsten, I would put the likelihood at pretty high. I would maybe say 70 to 80%. I think, not to put too much of a Washington hat on, but this is an opportunity for both parties to come together to sell something to their constituents. And there is an election next year, so the timing, the moon and the stars may align, that we may see some progress. And that will hopefully not be inconsistent with GDPR. That's what we don't want to see, right?
Yeah, so I see the evolution of attitudes on the regulatory side. I hear you saying there's an evolution of attitudes on the business side. At the same time, this is an American framework that's evolving on the trust question that always has this European framework, GDPR, already on the horizon. And there's also been, actually today from the audience, been voiced the concern that it might just overwhelm everything. And it might just basically put European views on American companies. Do you see that similarly, or do you see an American trust model evolving with these frameworks that can be truly American and still be compliant with the European framework? Or does it even matter?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. So when I talk to a lot of our customers, we've seen the gamut of responses when it comes to GDPR. Some think of it as a four-letter word. Other people are really focused on thinking about what they need to do to comply. Others are just kind of ignoring it altogether. And it's pretty much been a surprise for me. I mean, I thought, hey, this big legislation coming around, huge fines. Tomas mentioned 20 million euros, 4% of revenue earlier. That puts a price tag on getting things wrong from a security perspective. And yet what I've noticed is that we see roughly 3 different kinds of organizations. Some of the bigger multinationals with operations everywhere are really figuring out right now how they can make sure they're going to be at the appropriate level of compliance by May, when this big deadline's announced. We see another faction of organizations that are looking at GDPR, and they're not really sure if it applies to them. And obviously, one thing that's kind of intriguing about GDPR, and I want to kind of underscore some points that Tomas raised earlier, to me there are 3 elements of GDPR that are worth really calling out. The first that I mentioned earlier is the idea that it puts a business value on getting security right, so it puts an actual tangible dollar amount. The second part of GDPR is that it's not about telling you to do X, Y, and Z. It's about telling you how to achieve or what you should be trying to achieve through your security program. So it doesn't say implement solutions for end-to-end visibility. It says implement a capability so you can understand when you've been breached and report it within 72 hours. Now, obviously, if you want to be able to report on a breach within 72 hours, you need visibility as a precursor. But the nice thing with GDPR is it's less about the prescription and more about what you're trying to achieve ultimately. And the reason that's important is that that forces people to move away from what I think of as the sort of checkbox compliance mentality, which is where a lot of organizations have been struggling for many years with compliance regimes. So compliance has been a bit of a dirty word in security for a long time, right? People hear the word compliance, and the first thought is, okay, how do I minimally meet the requirement? What I think GDPR is really forcing is people to think about security fundamentally and having compliance be a byproduct of that. And so a lot of the organizations out there that really care about security, they're not so concerned because they expect that they'll be GDPR compliant as a result, minus a few adjustments here and there on how you do reporting and collecting of data and whatnot, but they feel that they're pretty much underway. Then you've got a third faction of organizations that are more or less, they understand that GDPR is an issue, but they're just going to say, look, we're going to wait until this gets enforced to see what happens. So I was talking to one major organization, household name, does a lot of stuff in financial services, very forward-thinking security-wise. But they said, look, our operations are mainly US-based. We probably have some customers around the world. But let's see what happens when someone tries to sue us for the first time for GDPR, and we're going to wait and see what happens then. Now, they actually have a good security posture, so I'm not so concerned. So they're not being that lackadaisical. They are being very deliberate in their actions. But at the same time, I've been surprised by the range of responses. But no one's really brought up that this is a European concern versus an American concern. They really are focused on the ultimate objectives and outcomes.
What's the Washington view on GDPR?
Well, I think, in the beginning, early days of the Obama administration, there was an effort to take a regulatory approach, and what the reaction was, I think the Washington view is mostly informed by companies in this space, by industry, which I think is important, and I think that I would characterize it as there is an opportunity for there to be, as was said earlier, to raise the overall level of privacy and security around the world. But the idea of developing regulation that would be directly harmonious with GDPR, so in other words, developing passing legislation that will require basically the US equivalent of GDPR, I don't think is anywhere near the likelihood at all. So I would draw a significant distinction between GDPR and the likelihood of data protection regulation in the US. US companies are very good at articulating why we don't need a regulatory approach to these issues. Obviously, we're continuing to see that that's not always the case. So I think, in some ways, data breach legislation may be kind of the happy medium to the response to GDPR. In other words, we'll take some steps, but we won't go quite as far as 4% of global revenues and things like that.
Actually, one thing. You mentioned Rob Joyce earlier, and it's interesting. So Rob Joyce, currently White House cybersecurity coordinator. Prior to that was the head of NSA's Tailored Access Operations Unit. And he gave a really wonderful talk at the Usenet Enigma conference in 2016. You can find it on YouTube. And with NSA's TAO, their objective was to hack into networks, right? So he said, look, this is how you can make my life harder. Right. And he said, look, if you really want to protect your network, you've got to know your network. You have to know the things, the security devices, and the objects inside it. And to me, what's interesting with that particular quote is he's really moving away from thinking about security in terms of do X, Y, or Z. He's saying, look, this comes down to a question of visibility. If you know what's going on in your environment, then you've got a shot at being able to protect against a wide variety of threats. And I think that, to me, is where the common denominator lies. People think about security strategy in the face of things like GDPR or data breach legislation or whatever the next interesting policy angle happens to be. They're going to be forced, I think, ultimately to deal with this alphabet soup by taking the common denominator of what the right security strategy is and then working their way upward. And when you juxtapose that with where our customers are thinking about security, their budget is not infinite. They would love to be able to do everything that they can to make things perfect, but they can't. And so what they're really doing is saying, what are the things that matter to me the most? What are the most important threats to my environment? And then working their way backwards by saying which ones matter most to my business as a whole, and then taking a much more prioritized and rigorous view. Some of the more forward-thinking organizations are doing that sort of thinking, and it's been helping them a lot, I think.
I think that the next, so to your question or point about what will be the next policy opportunity to focus on, I think what we will see, though, is a significant, we're beginning to see concern and possible regulation around the Internet of Things. So where GDPR is focused on potentially sensitive personal information, IoT may be a tool for collecting that, but it may not be. There is already legislation in the United States that will require that when the federal government procures IoT devices, again, this is proposed legislation, it is not law, that they satisfy certain security requirements. So I think in many ways, again, this might be the rising tide lifts all boats, because if you talk to people in Washington, they will say that using federal procurement, so the government's acquisition and buying power, to essentially regulate without directly regulating the entire landscape. It's their kind of sneaky way of trying to address this problem without totally creating a real screaming match. And I think that's, as we've been talking about, bridging the gap and bridging the distance. For me, the future of IoT and basically every company becoming a software company is frightening. Because we are not yet to a point where we have security and privacy by design, but we're going to have interconnection essentially by fiat. So I think we really need to think about the concepts that we've been talking about today as we move into the IoT space.
Yeah, and that's perfect. Before I open it up for questions, maybe to take a step back and bring us back onto our quest for a trust model that this day is supposed to be. How do you think this is going to evolve over the next 6 months, next year, maybe next 5 years? What kind of trust model may we be seeing? More kind of a regulatory trust model, maybe more of a European type trust model, maybe more of a business-driven trust model, or altogether? Difficult question.
I was hoping you'd look at Megan first. I guess the way I look at it, and I think Megan started talking about a really important point, which is that I think by 2020 we'll probably see about 1 trillion lines of code written by companies that never wrote a single line of code before, and that is a very scary concept, right? Because all that code's being written, and probably a good chunk of it will have some type of vulnerability or issue associated with it that could cause some pretty catastrophic failures to occur if not accounted for. And when you're living in a world like that, where you have to align incentives between different parties, I think the only way to do that effectively is by leveraging effective public-private cooperation. That's something people have talked about in the past, and there have been some successful instances of it. For example, here, Intertrust, if you think about cryptography, it's been a great place where there's been some good public-private cooperation, like the data encryption standard, the advanced encryption standard, all the major NIST publications around crypto were generally developed through good cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. And it's been very successful for creating some of the foundational underpinnings. I think where we've got to go next is really thinking about creating maybe certifications or requirements around devices, around security, as Megan alluded to. So there's a wonderful project going on at NIST right now around creating the equivalent of UL certification for IoT devices. If someone's going to build an IoT device, they have to have certain elements in place in that device to ensure that there's at least a certain baseline of security. Now, it's not perfect. I mean, people may still build devices that are compliant but not secure. But at least it'll avoid some of the low-hanging fruit attacks. I feel today most of these attacks are not complicated. I mean, they're default passwords and very, very basic things. If you can eliminate some of the low-hanging fruit, at least you raise the bar significantly for some of these issues down the line. And I think that's going to help a long way. Let's get to the basics first before we start getting too tripped up in the most advanced areas.
I think one of the benefits of the NIST effort underway is that in some ways it advances transparency, and so I often think of trust and transparency as partners in some ways. I think transparency can really lead to greater trust, and I think we are also at an inflection point. We see, at least in the US, there's polling information, survey information from Pew and Harris that suggests that consumers and citizens are becoming less and less trustful of their online activities. And so we really need to, I think, take this on and be thinking much more forward-leaning in terms of building a much more secure and sustainable Internet of Things. And one way to do that, I think, one way to build, maintain and actually enhance the trust of consumers is to increase transparency. Now, an average consumer is not going to pick up the next NIST special publication 800-550 and say, oh, this is great, I'm going to go off and buy that device. But what we can do is try to, there's another effort underway along that I think will be a good partner to the NIST effort, which is an effort by Consumer Reports, which I think writes about, it's a publication that's available worldwide. They currently review a lot of consumer products, and what they're hoping to develop or planning to develop is something called the digital standard, which will evaluate certain products based on their security features and their privacy practices. And so while the consumer may not be able to pick up and translate NIST publications, they will understand what's going on if they see a device that's got only half of a circle or a full circle or two full circles and say, there was an opportunity there was a transparency moment where either there was a bill of particulars in the development of the software or other testing that went on, and that information was provided to the marketplace in a transparent process, which allows consumers to make more informed choices. Hopefully, trust, security, and privacy both continue to evolve and grow, and we maintain the trust that we currently have so that we're well positioned for the next 5 years and hopefully many, many more with an interoperable space, and not, as some of us tend occasionally to talk about this concern over kind of balkanization. So.
And just to add to that, one of the ideas that we're experimenting a lot at the Berkman Klein Center right now is the idea of, will GDPR and other frameworks, will it sort of empower the consumers to bring their own data sets to a company instead of giving everything away and not knowing what's happening to it, sometimes not even knowing what is being taken. So I'd like to open it up to questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions left. If there's any questions from the audience, indicate yourself, identify yourself, and fire away. It's over there.
Couple of comments. I'm surprised that even today we are trying to, to have a battle of framework. I think GDPR against maybe an American version of GDPR. I think the ultimate goal is to have protection of consumers and business information for the greater goods of all. That should be the objective. Second, I'm also surprised that even today we are thinking of, can this device be secure? The problem, you can have a secure device, but you can misuse it and lose all your data. The device can be very secure, but if you don't know how to use it or if you don't operate it correctly, you can have big problems. And I'm surprised that we are not really learning or reusing what is successfully working in other verticals, in other ways. For example, the payment industry handles billions of transactions every day over hundreds of millions of devices every day. And to do that properly, and they do a pretty good job because they are doing it for decades, they have kind of operators that essentially oversee the security part of it to make sure that everything, and then they also take a risk-based approach so that they can guarantee that a transaction flow correctly from point A to point B. And we don't see any of that in other verticals. For example, in the internet space, we can imagine having operators that essentially are ensuring security for transaction for a pool of users for a particular application. Instead of that, we are still thinking, oh, can we have the right piece of cryptography in this hardware, meeting these NIST standards and things that will achieve very little, in fact, at the end of the day. So can you comment, because the real trust model should reuse what works and try to apply it to new verticals, instead of trying, should it be a law coming from Washington or a new cryptographic standards and things like that.
So actually, I don't think it's true at all that we haven't applied lessons. In fact, I mean, at RSA, we do a lot of work with both financial services as well as enterprises, and a lot of the underlying technology and concepts are lifted from one to the other. Now, I think there's obviously lessons you can learn from different verticals. When you look at the financial services vertical, I think one of the interesting lessons to learn from them is not just in the technology itself. One thing that the financial services vertical kind of has going for it when it comes to a security perspective is that you can tie an actual dollar amount to insecure practices, right? So something goes wrong on the financial services side, you can say we lost $10 million in fraud, or we lost $11 million because of X, Y, and Z. That similar framework has not existed in other organizations because it's a lot harder to tie a financial value to what's going on. And as a result, what ends up happening is that you start to lose some of the governance models that are needed to make security successful. So let me give you an example. We hear about vulnerabilities as if, and we've been talking about vulnerabilities for 20 plus years, and somehow still, when you look at major breaches, there's some vulnerability being exploited that causes the breach to occur. Yeah, we've known about vulnerabilities for a long time, so what really went fundamentally wrong? What goes fundamentally wrong in most organizations, it's not that the CISO doesn't understand the importance of vulnerabilities, it's not that the organization doesn't get it, it's that the CISO is typically responsible for identifying the issue, but they don't have the responsibility, or the authority rather, to fix it, right? The CIO or the person who owns infrastructure might be forced to fix the issue. So there's this conversation that has to happen between the people who understand the security details and those who might be forced to make the fixes accordingly. And that conversation has to center around what the actual tangible dollar value is from that particular issue and how that actually relates back to the underlying business objective. When you're in financial services, it's a lot easier to make that argument because you can tie a dollar amount to different issues. With other security domains, it's trickier to make that argument, but you can still do it now. We actually are developing a lot of frameworks for being able to understand likelihood of exploitation, criticality of the asset, and putting those pieces of information together so you can say, look, this is what it's going to cost us if we don't fix this particular vulnerability. This vulnerability is being exploited in the wild, which means it's probably going to be exploited in our network. And so we've got to fix it because it involves a critical business system. But to me, that's really where that question of having a much more business-driven view of security comes into play. And we've learned that a lot from financial services. I think we're applying it elsewhere. But in terms of the underlying technology, I think a lot of the pieces have been there. NOSA has gotten it perfect, by the way. I mean, there have been major attacks on financial services as well. We've certainly seen a number of them over time. But I think a number of industries can offer us interesting insight, not just financial services, the way that healthcare is done. If you look at the airline industry, there's interesting security practices across the board that have now been applied. I think the key question is how do you do the governance and the operationalization as opposed to just the technology part of it?
Yeah, I think most of the industries and sectors we've been talking about are actually regulated spaces. And so in some ways that makes it easier for us to quantify, as Zulfikar was saying, the cost of the absence of compliance and the absence of security. But in this space that we're entering, which is this idea of the Internet of Things, or things of the Internet as some people describe it, At this point, we don't have that type of an approach, and so I find that in some ways, I'm not advocating for regulation, but in some ways that limits our ability to, among other things, raise the importance of developing secure products and developing secure frameworks and governance practices among these companies that, as we were saying, are going to be writing hundreds of thousands of lines of code many times by, again, I'm not picking on the technologists, but folks who may have gone through school and never been taught about how to develop a secure and do a secure code writing process. So I think one of the challenges and opportunities that we have here is to think about how we're going to approach the Internet of Things from a governance standpoint. And I'll offer my one hypothesis or theory, which is that we might need to be thinking more about these issues in a more sustainable way. So thinking about cybersecurity and privacy as part of a company's sustainability process, because we know that companies that have sustainability policies, particularly those in the consumer goods space, are actually very successful companies. They do very well both in review of their stock price, but also in review of their accounting in their audit. They are successful companies. And so if we are able to, I think, translate sort of, well, we can take this product to market, but we know that it has these vulnerabilities within it. There is a cost to that. Among other costs, you may face litigation. You may face business reputational risk. And so trying to develop a more, to reuse the phrase, sustainable approach to, am I developing a product that's going to be here for 5 years? Is its lifetime 6 months? Am I going to communicate that to the consumer so that when they go in to buy the next baby monitor, they understand that actually it's going to be a brick in 2 years, and so they're going to have to buy a new one? Did I even think about whether I could update this device? I think that on the enterprise level, we are seeing significant improvement. I think we're entering a new phase of risk.
Yeah, I think Megan brings up a great point, which is that it's often not just about the underlying technology itself. I mean, you can do certain practices to secure certain parts of a technology, but security is a much more end-to-end process and has to be much more holistic, incorporating not just the technology itself, it's all the compensating controls around it, the operationalization, how do you get the policies in place and whatnot. So it's a much more complex issue that you can't resolve with one thing alone, but I think you brought up a great point that it often requires much more holistic thinking, and if you're not thinking of all the different elements, you're probably going to miss something critical.
Let's get some more voices in. There was a question over there.
I'm Chris Jacobi from White Hawk Software. I have heard the word trust quite a lot, but I have it heard always unqualified. I would like to bring a point that trust could be relative, and I can make an untechnical example. I would trust you absolutely that you wouldn't come and hit me. Would I trust you that you wouldn't speed somewhere on the road? Maybe not. So, at least from technical viewpoints, trust is very often very well-defined particular area. The question is, can you say something about this which isn't sounding just scalar?
I think trust has to be earned, right? And so there are ways that we can earn trust, one of which is through transparency. We can lose trust through failing to offering something, saying that it's secure or that it maintains your privacy and doesn't, in the end, do that. So I don't know that that's really an answer, but I think the opportunity here is where, I don't mean to keep on the soapbox of IoT, but there are great opportunities for companies to build and earn trust in the IoT space, but there are also tremendous opportunities for them to lose it, and that may take a lot of the other parts of the internet potentially with them.
Yeah, I think trust is actually not a good word typically in security, because typically you want to minimize what you trust when you're trying to build secure systems, especially in cryptography. This comes up all the time. And so I think the key with that term trust is for every organization to say, what are my key assumptions that matter to me, and can I keep those assumptions appropriate? And if I can't, then I've got to think about the compensating controls around it. And that's typically how most organizations think of this concept of trust. They figure out what it is they have to worry about the most and what matters most to their organization, and then they start to figure out what they can do about the different elements. And in some cases, you can't fix the problem easily. So I'll give you one example. I was talking to a big medical device manufacturer. So they implant things like pacemakers in people's bodies. And he said, look, if there's a vulnerability in the pacemaker, we have to perform surgery potentially to patch the pacemaker. And there's a certain surgical risk associated with performing surgery. So we've got to ask ourselves, do we care that much about this vulnerability in the pacemaker? Does it justify the surgical risk on the patient? If the vulnerability is a minor one, or if it's not being exploited by anybody, then perhaps we can wait a while to see what happens. Or alternatively, maybe we can put some other compensating controls in place to look for issues where that vulnerability might be exploited, and as a result, we can take a certain set of actions in those cases. So I think what you need to do fundamentally is identify what your key assets are, where those threats might lie, and identify whether or not your security strategy is really aligned with your overall objective. And that could be the objective of the business, of the organization. If it's a government, there may be a broader mission objective as well.
Great. I think we have time for about one, maybe two more questions. We're actually done, I hear. But there is a lunch break with these excellent experts, and I encourage you to walk up to them. It's been a fascinating panel, and join me in thanking them.